In this video, I will show you how to use Visual Studio Code to manage your metadata files in Salesforce. More specifically, we're going to show how to create custom objects with custom fields in Salesforce and then retrieve those metadata files that represent those objects in Visual Studio Code so we can manipulate them and potentially check them into source control down the line. So the first thing to do is to pick an org to work with. In this case, I have a trailhead org here that we're going to use. The domain name on that is this resilient shark here. So I'm just going to copy that and minimize my window. Now let's open Visual Studio Code. And within Visual Studio Code, we're going to want to go to the terminal window. So let's see, I don't seem to have one. We'll give Visual Studio Code just a second. It's a little slow loading extensions and things like that. So if we go to the terminal menu and say new terminal, we'll get a PowerShell command prompt since I'm on a PC. I imagine on a Mac this would be the terminal window, just as it's called. So from here, what we need to do is we need to make a connection to the org we want to work with. So we need to authorize that org with our login credentials. So in order to do that, from this terminal window, I will type sfdx, which is the Salesforce CLI application on the command line. And we will say force, or I always do that, force auth web login. And when we log in to the form that comes up when I run this command, we will store those user credentials locally on our computer. So we want to give those user credentials a better name than this long resilient shark with a unique string ID at the end of it. So we'll give it an alias. In order to do that, you hit -A for alias, and we'll say DX demo for our alias. So when we run that command, we should get a browser window that pops up with the Salesforce login form. So here we are. So I know that my username is that plus the domain, and I have already reset my password. If you need to know how to do that, it's pretty easy from the main landing page on a Trailhead Playground. But in this case, I already have a password set up, so I'll log in with that. And we're in. So I've authorized my Salesforce CLI and therefore the access via Visual Studio Code to access this org. So I'm just going to close all that because we don't care about that right now. So now that we are connected to a Salesforce org, we should actually go back to the org we're working with to create a custom object that we can retrieve the files for. So I'll show you how to just open whatever org you want from the command line. So to do that, we use the same sfdx application on the command line, and we say sfdx force org list, and this will show that the trailhead playground that we just authorized shows up here as DX demo. So the resilient shark domain name is here, and the DX demo alias is here. So if we ever want to open that org, we can do that using the sfdx application with sfdx force org open, and then -u for user, because the alias is really just another name for that long username, the Mitch route, resilient shark, blah, 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 blah. So if we say DX demo, that will once again open our org our trailhead playground that we want to work with. And there will be no login prompt this time. So here we are in setup directly of that org. Now, for demonstration, let's create a simple object, simple custom object. So in this case, we'll do something silly like, we're going to call this fun facts. Well, we're going to call it fun fact and let the plural be fun facts. So there we go. So we'll create that. And just to make it seem semi-real, we'll give it 2 new fields. First field will be a text field, and we'll just say that's the fact itself. and we'll give that a length of 32. And next. And then let's do one more, just so we can see a couple of different custom fields. Let's do a number, and let's call that field fun level. And our fun level only goes from 0 to 9, so let's just give it a length of 1. Great. So now we have a custom object called fun fact with two custom fields, fun level and fact. Great. So you guys all know how to do that, I presume. So what we want to do is get the metadata, the XML files or the human readable files that represent these objects into our Visual Studio Code so that we can do things with them outside of Salesforce. So let's open Visual Studio Code. Now, the SFDX application, the Salesforce CLI, has a whole section of commands for pulling files or pulling metadata out of Salesforce. So in this case, what we want is SFDX force source retrieve. Oh, I need my little colon there. Retrieve, and then -m for metadata. And here is where you specify what kind of metadata you're trying to retrieve. So in this case, we're just going to say, give me all of the custom objects. Except that you need to know how to spell the word objects. And you need to make it singular. So if we say force source retrieve custom object, we'll actually get an error. It says this directory does not contain a valid Salesforce DX project. So you can't just start pulling these files willy-nilly. Salesforce wants you to have some structure in your VSCode destination so that it kind of knows where to put the various objects, the various files. So what we want to do now is create a Salesforce DX project. So in order to do that, the best way is to use Control-Shift-P. So you can see here it says show all commands, Control-Shift-P. That's also called the command palette. On Mac it would be Command-Shift-P. So if I hit Control-Shift-P, it pops up the command palette. And you can see I use it a lot, so you can see the create project is the very first command at the top of the list. If you don't have that at the top of your list, you can just type the word create and it'll filter and your create project will come to the top. Now if you can't quite get that hotkey combination down, you can't do the Control-Shift-P, you can also find that in the run menu. I'm sorry, it's the view menu, command palette, Control-Shift-P. So you can click there and get the same effect. Great. So now we have the create project command at the top of our list. Let's click on that. And you see it's activating extensions down here in the bottom left corner. That can take a minute. So this create project, especially the first time you run it, takes a little while. And it could be, you think nothing's happening and it's not doing anything. I've done this so many times where I'm just running that command over and over and over again, and eventually it pops up. But really, just the first time you run it, it takes quite some time. So don't be spooked by that. Don't worry about your computer not working or something. This is very common, unless you have a supercomputer. And I had time for a drink of water, and there's no editing going on here, no speeding up. It's still really thinking about that command. It would be a nice feature if they were to give you some sort of progress bar or hourglass or something, but nothing happens for quite some time. There, see, that was it. I didn't touch anything. That is how long it took on my computer to pop that up. So let me show you the second time you run it. So if you click off of it, it goes away. Now if I hit Control-Shift-P again, you get that menu popping up. I click Create Project, and you see the selection of what kind of project you want comes up just right away. So we're going to call this project DX Demo. And you can see it's taking its time on this one too. What should happen here is a file selection dialog will pop up asking me where I want to put the files. But it is brutally slow. DX Demo. Come on. There we go. Okay, so now it's asking us where we want to put the files it generates when it creates an SFDX project. So in my case, I like to put my stuff in a SRC or source directory at the root of my hard drive. So down here I have SRC. I'm going to select that and say create project. Now, so the Salesforce CLI or SFDX creates all these files for you in a directory structure for you. So let me show you a little bit. Well, you can see the directory structure here in Visual Studio Code. The main things you need to worry about, well, the main folder you need to worry about is this Force App folder. If you click on this, you can see Force App main default. That is the main area where Salesforce is going to put all of your files when you retrieve them from Salesforce. So you can see by default you get all these different categories. This folder will have your applications. This folder, your Aura pages, your Apex classes go in classes, layouts, Lightning Web components, objects, which is the one we're concerned about because we're creating objects in this demo, and tabs, triggers, permission sets. Theoretically, you can pull out anything you can customize in the UI in Salesforce. You can pull it out into a file in one of these SFDX projects and save it in human readable format, which is great. Okay, so the thing we care about, we want to run our SFDX command to get those custom objects and two custom fields into our Visual Studio Code project. So let's go find our terminal window again. And let's see if we can run that retrieve command again. So let's try SFDX force source retrieve. I actually forgot. Well, before we do that, one thing that's nice to do when you're working with an org in Visual Studio Code is to set your default org. So in our case, we have that DX demo org we want to set as default. So in order to do that, we do the Control-Shift-P to pull up our command palette. And you can see at the top of this list, set a default org. So if you don't have this pop up immediately like I do, you could just do SFDX and get a list of all of your SFDX commands in the command palette. Or in this case, you can just type org, and that should give you a list of things that are org related. Ooh, we did not like that. Yeah, so you can see how slow this palette can be. Let's do this over again. And if I pop it up immediately, it gives me a better list of things I've used in the past. But if this command prompt immediately, you type in default, it will filter out open default org or set a default org. In our case, we want to set a default org. And it'll take a second. It has to activate some extensions. Okay, so there we go. So we had to do it a couple times to get knock some of the rust off of it. But up here you can see it has a couple of commands that you could run, but then underneath that you can see there's a list of some orgs that I've authorized via my Salesforce CLI. So here we see DX demo is one of our options, and that's the org we're working with. So let's select that one. And once we've selected that, we can see that our default org is displayed here in the bottom left corner. This is really cool. So we know at all times which org we're actually authorized and pointed to right now. This is the one we're actively working with. And now that you've set a default org, you can actually click this and it'll automatically open up your command palette if you want to change what that default org is. We're going to keep ours the same because this is the org we're working with. But this is a nice thing to switch back and forth between different orgs that you've authorized. Okay, great. So now we have a default org. Let's go back to our terminal window. And in our terminal window, we can run the SFDX command for retrieving our source, just like we did before, but we got an error saying we didn't have a SFDX project. So now if we do SFDX force source retrieve, and then with the metadata parameter, we can specify what kind of metadata, what kind of thing we're pulling down from Salesforce. And in this case, we want a custom object. And the way I've written this, it will pull down every custom object in the organization that we're currently pointed to. In this case, we only have actually no, I might not. Let's not do it that way. That's really just bad practice. Let's say custom object is the type. So we want to get a custom object, and we want the custom object that has the API name of specifically of the object that we just created. So let's go back to our fun fact object and go to details, and let's grab that API name and let's paste it there. So this tells Salesforce, let's grab the metadata files for specifically this custom object. So if we hit enter there, it's going out to the Salesforce org. It's trying to find that custom object by that name, and there it is. It's pulled it down. So you can see here we have the fun facts object name, and in addition to that we have two files, one each for the fields that we put onto that custom object. And you have the right names and everything else. So you can see the path here is force app main default objects, and then under the name of the object are the fields. And if you go over here and look in the same path in our file explorer on the left hand side, we can see that in the objects we expand that, and we have here's the fun facts object, and below that are the two custom fields that we created. Now if we look at those fields, we can open these files. So here's the fact field, our text field. We can see that it's not unique. It doesn't have a unique identifier attribute on it. It's a type text, length of 32. It's not an external ID. Here's the name, everything, label. Everything that represents that field in Salesforce is right here. So one of the cool things we can do, if we decide 32 characters is not long enough for our facts, we got some long facts. Let's make it 128 characters. So if we change that file, save it, and then I go back to this field, I right click on it, and I can say deploy source to org. So source in this case is this file we have in Visual Studio Code, and we're going to send that file to the org, and that will change the attribute on the field. Okay, so right click context menu, deploy source to org. Here we go. Running. Okay, so we have deployed our file and the changes up to Salesforce. So if you didn't already have our default org opened up and we want to go look at it, you can click on this. Well, actually, that's probably not the best way to do it. You can just go up here and say command palette, open default org. Click on that, and then a new browser window already authorized to your org will pop up. We already had a browser window to that, so we didn't need it in this case. I just wanted to show you that feature. Okay, so in that case, let's just close this browser tab since we don't need it. We have our fun fact object page already open and set up. So let's go to fields and relationships. Let's click on that. Oh, we don't have to click on it. You can see here in the data type column of the fact column, it's now 128. So originally it was 32 characters long. Now it's 128. So you can see how you can start manipulating the attributes and what makes up the object in readable text files, which is pretty cool. One of the main reasons to have your metadata as human readable files is so that you can put them into source control, something like Git, work with other people, and really so that your creative property or the things you've been building exist outside of Salesforce in some independent repository so they can be deployed to various orgs. Actually, that reminds me, one thing we can do, we can take our fun fact and deploy it to one of the other orgs that I already have authorized. So let's demonstrate how to do that. That's an interesting exercise. So in this case, let's list my orgs real quick so we can kind of see what I'm working with here. So if I say SFDX force org list, I think I have 4 or 5 different orgs on here. Let's use my dev hub. So let's set the default. I guess I could have just done this. I click here and I can set the default to dev hub. So now in the bottom left corner you should see it update to dev hub. Cool. So now we're pointing to a different org. And I can now take my fun facts object and I can deploy it to the default org. When it says deploy source to org, it means deploy source to your default org. So that takes a second to run. Great, looks like it completed successfully. And if we want to open our default org, we do the command palette command, open default org, and we should go directly into the setup of my DevHub org. And here we are. So in the object manager, we can search for facts or just fact. And you can see here's the custom object we just created. And if we go into the fields, you can see we have the updated length of the text field and both of our custom columns. So everything's there. So if you need to switch back and forth between deploying to various orgs, if you have a development process where you want to develop in one org, but then test to make sure everything deploys into a fresh org, you can create scratch orgs and deploy directly to that. You can deploy to your friend's org. You can work on it with a partner that is running their own orgs, and you can collaborate later. It's a very flexible and very powerful concept. And that's everything. Thanks for watching.